The morning light filters through the old Venetian blinds of their bedroom, casting thin shadows across the hardwood floor that hasn't been updated since the 1980s. I'm narrating this story to you, and I need you to understand something from the beginning. This isn't just another marriage advice video. This is the story of two people who almost lost everything, and by everything, I mean each other, and more importantly, they mean the life they'd built together over more than 6 decades. The clock on the nightstand reads 6:47 a.m., and somewhere in this house, there's a silence that speaks louder than any argument ever could. I watched the old wedding photograph on the dresser, dated June 14, 1963. The colors have faded to a soft sepia tone, and in it, Robert and Margaret stand together, his hand on her waist, her smile so genuine it seems to light up the entire frame. 61 years. That's what I want you to hold on to as I tell you this. 61 years. But there's a moment, somewhere between year 18 and year 20, when Robert and Margaret almost didn't make it past year 20. They almost gave up. They almost became a statistic. They almost became two people who lived in the same house and died as strangers. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. What nearly destroyed them wasn't infidelity. It wasn't a dramatic betrayal or a sudden crisis. It wasn't even a catastrophic financial loss or a terminal diagnosis delivered by a doctor with tired eyes. What nearly destroyed Robert and Margaret's marriage was something far more insidious, far more quiet, and far more common than any of those things. It was 5 mistakes, 5 simple, almost invisible patterns that they didn't even realize they were making until one day, Margaret packed a bag and sat on the edge of the guest room bed, wondering if she still loved the man sleeping down the hall. It was the kind of erosion that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with thunder or lightning. It comes like rust on metal, like the slow fade of a photograph left too long in the sun, like the way you stop noticing someone's voice after you've heard it every single day for 18 years. Robert was born in 1942 in a small town called Millbrook, Pennsylvania. His father was a factory worker, his mother a homemaker, who spent her days canning vegetables and listening to the radio. He had 2 sisters and no brothers, which meant he grew up watching women solve problems, make decisions, and hold households together. He learned early that men worked and women managed, that love was a quiet thing expressed through providing and protecting, not through words or gestures or the kind of affection you see in movies. Margaret was born in 1944 in Des Moines, Iowa, to a librarian mother and a teacher father. She grew up surrounded by books and conversations and the idea that words mattered, that communication was the foundation of everything. She was the kind of girl who kept a diary, who wrote long letters to her cousins, who believed that problems could be solved if you just talked about them long enough. When they met in 1960 in a college cafeteria at the University of Minnesota, they didn't know any of this about themselves. They only knew that something shifted when she laughed at his joke about the mystery meatloaf, and he felt something catch in his chest. She wore her hair in a neat bob, and she had a way of looking directly at people when they spoke to her, as if nothing in the world mattered except understanding what they were saying. He wore his father's watch, wound a little too tight on his wrist, and he had hands that moved when he talked, hands that wanted to build things, fix things, create things. They were impossibly young, and they were completely unprepared for what it would mean to spend 61 years together. The first years were golden. Everyone says this about new marriages, but in Robert and Margaret's case, it was true. They had 3 children in quick succession, James in 1965, Linda in 1967, and Catherine in 1969. Robert worked his way up from engineer to senior engineer at a technology company that was beginning to boom in the late 60s. Margaret stayed home, as was expected of women then, and she did it with a grace that seemed effortless. But effortless is a lie that time tells us about the past. What Margaret was actually doing was managing a household, raising 3 children, maintaining a marriage, attending church, volunteering at the school, and slowly, in the quietest possible way, beginning to disappear. She would stand in the kitchen at 3 a.m., unable to sleep, wondering if this was all there was, if all those dreams she'd written about in her diary were simply things that happened to other people, not to people like her. Robert was working 60-hour weeks. He believed he was doing this for his family, for Margaret, for the children. He believed that his sacrifice was an expression of love. Every promotion was a gift he was laying at her feet, even though she never asked for any of them. Every evening, he came home tired and quiet, wanting nothing more than to read the paper and watch television before bed. He was a good man. He was a responsible man. He was a man who loved his wife and children with the kind of steady, reliable love that doesn't demand anything back because it was never meant to be transactional. It was meant to be infinite and without expectation. But love without communication is like a plant without water. It looks fine for a while. It stays green, but eventually it withers. The mistakes began so small that nobody noticed them. The first mistake was keeping score. This is perhaps the deadliest mistake any marriage can make, and it's the one that nobody talks about because it happens entirely in silence. Keeping score means that when Margaret made dinner and Robert didn't compliment her, she noted it. When she stayed up with a sick child and Robert slept through it, she noted that too. When she asked him about his day and he gave one-word answers, she noted that he never asked about hers. When Robert worked weekends and missed his son's Little League game, he told himself he was working towards something important, but Margaret was keeping a mental ledger. She was documenting, cataloging, collecting evidence of all the ways he didn't notice her, all the ways he was absent, all the ways his love felt like duty rather than desire. Robert, on his side, was keeping his own score. He was noticing the complaints, the sighs, the way Margaret's smile never quite reached her eyes anymore. He was noting every time she seemed disappointed in him, every time he felt like he wasn't enough, every time her expectations exceeded his capacity to meet them. They were both building a case. They were both gathering ammunition. They didn't realize that they were building a wall between them, brick by invisible brick. By 1975, the wall was high enough that they could barely see over it. Margaret had started working part-time as a school librarian, a dream she'd held onto since she was a young woman. She had her own money now, her own identity outside of wife and mother. But instead of celebrating this, Robert felt it as a threat. If she was independent, then she didn't need him. If she didn't need him, then what was the point of all his sacrifice? He began to pull away further. Margaret felt this withdrawal and responded by trying harder, planning dinners, asking more questions, seeking more connection. But Robert interpreted this as nagging. He saw it as dissatisfaction with him. The gap between them widened. This brings us to the second mistake, trying to change each other. By 1978, Robert and Margaret had entered a phase that anyone who has been married knows well. It's the phase where you start pointing out each other's flaws with the kind of constant, gentle criticism that is somehow more corrosive than any screaming fight. Margaret wanted Robert to be more expressive, more present, more interested in her thoughts and feelings. She would say things like, "You never really listen to me," or "Why can't you be more romantic?" or "Don't you want to know what I think about anything?" Robert wanted Margaret to be less critical, less needy, less likely to cry over what he considered minor disappointments. He would say things like, "Why are you always so unhappy?" or "Stop trying to change who I am," or "I do my best and it's never enough." They were both trying to sand each other down, to reshape the person they'd married into the person they thought they should be. It never works. What it does instead is create a slow, grinding resentment that shows up in the smallest interactions. The way she'd flinch when he touched her. The way he'd leave the room when she entered it, not out of anger, but out of a kind of quiet defeat. The way they'd both learn to make themselves smaller, so as not to trigger the other person's disappointment. Margaret started confiding in her sister, Patricia, who lived 3 states away, but with whom she spoke every Sunday on the telephone. Patricia would listen to Margaret's stories about Robert's coldness, his inability to express emotion, his lack of interest in the meaningful conversations that Margaret craved. Patricia would tell her that she deserved better, that Robert was selfish for working so much and so unwilling to change. Robert, for his part, would occasionally mention to his friend Bill, a colleague from work, that Margaret was never satisfied, that no matter what he did, it wasn't good enough. Bill would commiserate and remind him that wives were complicated, that trying to understand them was a losing battle, that the best strategy was to stay busy and wait for the mood to pass. Neither of them knew that they were trading intimacy with their spouse for a simulation of understanding with their friends. They were choosing to be known by people who weren't trying to change them, which made it so much easier to be with them. The third mistake was silence instead of honesty. This is where the real damage began to compound. By 1982, Robert and Margaret had learned not to fight. Fighting had become too painful, too exhausting, too much of a reminder of how far apart they'd grown. Instead, they simply didn't talk about the things that mattered. When Robert came home late from work for the third time that week, Margaret didn't ask him why or tell him she'd made a special dinner that he'd missed. She simply cleared the table and washed the dishes in silence. When Margaret bought a new dress without consulting Robert about the expense, he didn't voice his concern about the household budget. He simply noticed the dress hanging in the closet and said nothing. When their daughter Linda came home with a failing grade and needed support and guidance from both of her parents, Robert and Margaret called a family meeting where they exchanged polite words and practical solutions, but neither of them was really present. They were both hiding. They were both protecting themselves from further disappointment by refusing to be vulnerable, refusing to ask for what they needed, refusing to speak the truth. The thing about silence is that it creates a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. Into the space where honest words should have lived, other things moved in. Resentment lived there. Loneliness lived there. Shame lived there. The shame of feeling like you weren't enough, like you'd somehow failed at the most important relationship of your life, like you'd promised forever and ended up with a stranger. Margaret would lie awake at night, her back to Robert, and compose letters in her mind that she would never send. She would imagine conversations where she told him exactly how unhappy she was, exactly how invisible she felt, exactly how much she missed him, even though he was sleeping 3 feet away from her. But in the morning, she would wake up and say nothing. She would make his coffee the way he liked it, with just a splash of cream and 1 sugar. She would pack his lunch and send him off to work with a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. Robert would wake up and notice that Margaret seemed distant, but instead of asking her about it, he would convince himself that this was just who they were now. They were a married couple. They'd passed the phase of passion and excitement. This was what stability looked like. This was what commitment meant. The fourth mistake is the one that nearly destroyed them completely. It's the mistake that nobody warns you about because it doesn't feel like a mistake when you're making it. It feels like acceptance. It feels like wisdom. It feels like the understanding that comes with age and experience. The fourth mistake is autopilot. Sometime in the mid-1980s, Robert and Margaret stopped trying altogether. They stopped fighting. They stopped attempting to change each other. They stopped the uncomfortable conversations. They created a rhythm, a routine, a way of moving through life together that didn't require any real engagement from either of them. Robert would wake up, shower, eat breakfast, go to work, come home, eat dinner, watch television, and go to sleep. Margaret would manage the house, volunteer at the school, visit with friends, shop, read in the evenings, and go to sleep. They existed in the same space, but they were living separate lives. They developed separate interests, separate friendships, separate emotional worlds. Robert bonded with the men at his office. Margaret found connection with other women at the library where she worked, at the church, at the book club she joined. They became less necessary to each other, and that felt like a relief. No more fighting. No more disappointment. No more trying. They could just be. But here's what happens on autopilot. Time passes much faster. Days blur into weeks. Weeks blur into months. Months blur into years. When you're not actively engaging with your life, when you're not looking directly at your partner and seeing them, the years go by like a train you're watching from a distance. In 1990, Robert and Margaret celebrated their 25th anniversary with a nice dinner at a restaurant they'd read about in a magazine. They didn't have much to say to each other. They made polite conversation about their children, about work, about the weather. They told each other the things you're supposed to tell each other after 25 years. I love you. I'm glad I married you. It was a nice dinner. Nothing had broken. Nothing had changed. But nothing had grown either. They had become people who loved each other in the way that people love a comfortable house or a familiar piece of music. It was pleasant. It was safe. But it was not alive. James graduated from high school in 1983 and went to college in California. Linda went to college in Boston in 1985. Catherine stayed closer to home, attending the University of Minnesota, but she was building her own life, her own future. Robert and Margaret found themselves alone in the house for the first time in 20 years. Margaret thought this might be an opportunity to reconnect with Robert, to figure out who they were as a couple without the buffer of children. She suggested they take a weekend trip, that they travel somewhere they'd always wanted to go. Robert said maybe someday, but he was focused on his work. He was being considered for a director position, which would mean a significant raise, which would give them security for retirement. The opportunity to travel seemed frivolous in comparison. Margaret said nothing. She simply added it to her mental ledger, another item in a long list of things that didn't happen, dreams that didn't materialize, connections that didn't form. Then came the fifth mistake, and this one was different. This one had an external catalyst. This one had a name, Thomas. Thomas was married to Patricia, Margaret's sister. Thomas was a charming man, attentive and interested and good at making people feel seen. When he was around Margaret, he asked her questions about herself. He remembered details from stories she'd told him years earlier. He laughed at her jokes. He looked at her when she was speaking. He was everything that Robert had stopped being. Thomas wasn't a villain in this story. He wasn't trying to seduce Margaret. He was simply being a good friend, and that simple act of paying attention, which should have been a basic component of Robert's love, became something that made Margaret feel alive for the first time in years. She started looking forward to family gatherings where Thomas would be present. She started paying attention to how she looked, wearing better clothes, doing her hair, putting on makeup. She started engaging in conversations in a way that made people notice her again. Robert saw this shift, and for the first time in years, he felt something. He felt fear. He felt jealousy. He felt the knowledge that he was losing his wife not to infidelity, not to scandal, not to anything dramatic, but to the simple fact that she preferred someone else's company to his. That's when something shifted. Robert realized, with the kind of clarity that only comes when you're about to lose something, that he didn't actually want to lose Margaret. He didn't want to live in a world where they were divorced, where they'd failed, where all those years had been a prelude to an ending instead of a beginning. He wanted her back. He wanted to fix this. He wanted to remember why he'd loved her in the first place. But Margaret was too far gone by then. She wasn't asking to be rescued. She wasn't asking for grand gestures or dramatic declarations. She was simply tired. She was tired of trying. She was tired of not mattering. She was tired of waiting for someone to notice that she was drowning. In 1991, Margaret told Robert that she wanted a divorce. She didn't say it with anger. She said it with resignation. She said it the way someone might say that they were resigning from a job they'd held for too long, with gratitude for the experience, but relief that they'd finally have the chance to do something else. Robert panicked. He saw his future splitting apart. He saw a future where he was alone, where he'd failed at the most important thing he'd ever attempted. He begged Margaret to stay. He promised to change. He promised to be present. He promised to listen. He promised to travel, to talk, to engage, to be the husband she'd always wanted. But promises feel hollow when they come so late, when they come only in response to a threat of abandonment rather than out of genuine understanding and desire to change. Margaret packed a bag and moved into the guest room. She made appointments with divorce lawyers. She had conversations with her children, who were adults now but who had to process that their parents' marriage was ending. It was Catherine who changed everything. Catherine, who was just 20 years old, who was still young enough to believe that things could be fixed, that love could be powerful enough to overcome even years of neglect and silence. Catherine sat down with her parents and asked them a single question: "How long have you been unhappy?" And in the asking of that question, something shifted. It became possible to answer. It became possible to tell the truth. It became possible to admit that they hadn't been unhappy with their lives or their marriage in some fundamental way. They had been unhappy with themselves, with the way they'd chosen to move through the world, with the way they decided that playing it safe was the same as building something real. Robert and Margaret got into couples therapy. This was 1992. Couples therapy was not common in their demographic, and it certainly wasn't something they would have chosen voluntarily, but they were desperate. They were standing at the edge of a cliff, and they were finally willing to ask for help climbing back up. The therapist was a woman named Dr. Sheila Williams, who specialized in marriages that had reached a critical juncture. She didn't tell them that they could fix everything or that they could go back to the way things were. She told them something much more radical. She told them that they had been on the same team all along, but they'd been playing like enemies. She told them that the mistakes they'd made weren't unforgivable. They were human. They were the mistakes that almost every marriage makes at some point. The question was whether they wanted to keep making them or whether they wanted to try something different. In the sessions, Margaret learned to express her feelings without attacking Robert. She learned to say, "I feel invisible," instead of, "You don't pay attention to me." She learned to ask for what she needed instead of silently resenting Robert for not providing it. Robert learned to listen not with the intention of defending himself or fixing the problem, but with the intention of understanding his wife. He learned that Margaret's unhappiness wasn't a criticism of him personally, but a reflection of her own needs and dreams that had been deferred for too long. He learned that presence wasn't the same as proximity. Presence meant putting down the newspaper and making eye contact. Presence meant remembering things she'd told him and asking follow-up questions. Presence meant choosing to be in the relationship actively instead of just existing in it passively. They spent 8 months in therapy, going once a week, sometimes twice a week, doing the hard work of excavating the past and understanding how they'd gotten to such a broken place. They learned about their attachment styles, about the way their childhood experiences had shaped their capacity for intimacy, about the ways they were both contributing to the destruction of their marriage. Robert talked about his father, about the way he'd learned that love was expressed through provision and protection rather than through affection and communication. Margaret talked about her mother, about the way she'd been taught to be accommodating and gracious even when her own needs were going unmet. They talked about the baby boomer promise that you could simply marry for love and everything would work out. They talked about the reality that love is not enough. Love is the beginning, but it's not the destination. The destination is built through choice, through work, through daily decisions to show up for each other. By late 1992, Margaret moved back into their bedroom. But things were different. They were not the same people who'd climbed into that bed thousands of times before. They were people who had stared into the abyss and decided to turn around. They were people who had decided that giving up wasn't the answer, not because they were trapped or afraid of being alone, but because they had glimpsed, for just a moment, the possibility of what they could build if they worked together instead of against each other. It wasn't a return to the golden days of their early marriage. Those days were gone, and they didn't try to recapture them. Instead, they built something different. They built a marriage based on honesty instead of pretense. They built a marriage based on active choice instead of passive acceptance. They built a marriage based on vulnerability instead of self-protection. The years that followed were not always easy. They still had disagreements. They still sometimes felt frustrated with each other. But they had learned how to fight in a way that didn't destroy them. They had learned how to admit when they were wrong. They had learned how to prioritize the relationship above their own need to be right. Robert made a decision to step back from the constant pursuit of career advancement. He began to leave the office at reasonable hours. He started reading books that Margaret recommended. He learned to cook, not because Margaret demanded it, but because it became a way for them to spend time together, to create something together. Margaret made a decision to stop waiting for Robert to change her life. She pursued her own interests more fully. She took writing classes at the community college. She joined a women's group at church. She became more herself, not in rebellion against the marriage, but in service to it. You cannot have an authentic partnership with someone unless you are an authentic person. Robert and Margaret learned that their capacity to grow as individuals was directly connected to their capacity to grow as a couple. They traveled. They went to Italy in 1994 and spent 3 weeks simply wandering through small villages and talking. They didn't have a detailed itinerary. They didn't have a master plan. They simply walked and talked and rediscovered how to be curious about each other. They took trips to visit their children and their grandchildren. They invested in those relationships with a presence and intention that they'd previously been unable to offer. They became the kind of grandparents who showed up, who listened, who were interested in the lives of young people in a genuine way. They joined a group at church for married couples, and they began to share their story with others who were struggling. They became mentors, in a way, though they never positioned themselves as experts. They simply told the truth about what had happened to them and what had saved them. In 1997, Robert had a heart attack. He survived, but it was a significant event that clarified for both of them how much time they had left and how important it was to use that time well. He cut back his hours at work even further. They spent more time together. They took more trips. They sat on their porch in the evenings and watched the sun go down. They held hands without it being awkward. They spoke words of love without it feeling like an obligation. They built a life that was intentional and present. They stayed married. They stayed together through Robert's second heart attack in 2003. They stayed together through Margaret's cancer diagnosis in 2008 and her recovery. They stayed together through the slow aging process, the way their bodies changed, the way their energy levels diminished. They stayed together because they had chosen to stay together every single day for more than 60 years. Margaret passed away in 2024 at the age of 80. Robert is still alive, 90 years old, living in a memory care facility because his mind is beginning to leave him, even as his body remains. When he's having a good day, he still remembers Margaret. He asks about her. He wants to know where she is. And the people who care for him tell him stories about their marriage, about the way they fought and survived and built something beautiful out of brokenness. They tell him that he loved her. They tell him that he chose her every single day for 61 years. If you're listening to this story, I want you to think about something. The mistakes that Robert and Margaret made, the mistakes that nearly destroyed their marriage, the mistakes that they almost didn't recover from, those are probably mistakes that you're making too. You are keeping score. You are trying to change someone. You are choosing silence instead of honesty. You are operating on autopilot. You are forgetting that you're on the same team. These are the mistakes that our culture enables. We are taught to be independent, to never need anyone, to keep our cards close to our chest, to protect ourselves at all costs. We are taught to view conflict as destructive instead of as an opportunity for deeper understanding. We are taught that love is supposed to be effortless, that if you have to work at your relationship, then something is wrong. But that's a lie. Love is work. Partnership is work. Creating something that lasts is work. And the question is not whether you're willing to do the work. The question is whether you're willing to do the work before you reach the crisis point, before your spouse is packing a bag, before you're staring into the abyss of your own failure. I'm telling you this story because Robert and Margaret's story is not unique. It's not even unusual. It's the story of so many marriages that quietly break while the world goes on around them. It's the story of people who loved each other but didn't know how to love each other in a way that was nourishing and real. It's the story of people who were too proud or too afraid or too convinced that this was just the way things were supposed to be to reach out and say, "I need help. I'm drowning. I'm dying in this silence. Please, someone help me." If you are in a marriage right now, if you are choosing to be with another person in a committed way, please listen to what I'm telling you. You have a choice. You can wait until the crisis comes, until someone packs a bag and moves into the guest room, until you're looking at divorce lawyers and wondering where you went wrong. Or you can choose, today, to do the work. You can choose to speak the truth. You can choose to listen without defending yourself. You can choose to see your partner, really see them, every single day. You can choose to be on their team. The mistakes that Robert and Margaret made are mistakes that you can avoid. The crisis that they faced is a crisis that you can prevent. The recovery that they experienced is recovery that you can have, but you have to be willing to start before everything falls apart. You have to be brave enough to be vulnerable. You have to be strong enough to admit when you're wrong. You have to be committed enough to show up every single day and choose your person. That's what Robert did. That's what Margaret did. That's what kept them together for 61 years. And that's what will keep you together too. If you choose it. If you're willing to do the work. If you're brave enough to believe that your relationship is worth saving, not because you're trapped, not because you're afraid of being alone, but because you genuinely believe that your partner is worth it. That's the message. That's the lesson. That's the story that needs to be told.